Welcome to Conversations for a Preferred Future. My name is Jan Spencer, and I'm coming to you from Eugene, Oregon. This episode is creating alternatives to capitalism and the consumer culture. It's a two-part series. This is part one. Thanks for joining us. Let's get started. Points of departure. First, I want to mention you can pause this YouTube presentation anytime you want to take a closer look. Several items to say about the presentation. First, I don't believe we can afford capitalism and the consumer culture. Most of the individuals and organizations I refer to in this presentation do not think of themselves as alternatives to capitalism and the consumer culture, although their work shows that they are creating alternatives. Alternatives can happen at different scales, from home into the community and widespread into society. A sustainable and uplifted society will call on individuals and organizations to make far more ambitious and purposeful use of available allies and assets. And I strongly believe positive human potential is our greatest renewable resource. I'd like to start by just saying a little bit about myself. My primary interests are about economics, permaculture, urban land use, the environment, positive human potential, system change, and I love bike riding. My primary motivation: humans deserve better than the consumer culture, and nature deserves better than the consumer culture. This is part of my neighborhood in Eugene. The yellow rectangle is my quarter-acre suburban property. The other rectangles indicate permaculture-friendly properties. My quarter-acre suburban property here in Eugene is a microcosm of the larger presentation. My place has many allies, assets, and actions. I do prioritize my time and money here. I've gained many benefits, and in a way, my place is a small alternative to capitalism and the consumer culture. This is a schematic diagram of my property. North is to the right, south is to the left. You can see identification. There's the bungalow, a detached living space, the sunroom, a patio that was turned into passive solar, the main house, former driveway. I took the driveway out. There's edible landscaping everywhere, gardens, 6,500-gallon rainwater system. What you see here is my backyard. It was a grassy backyard. Check the before image in the upper right-hand corner. My place serves as a platform for a selected boycott of the mainstream economy. It also allows me to significantly reduce my ecological footprint. I would also add that millions of suburban properties making this type of transformation would create tens and tens of thousands of new jobs, an important component of a future economy based on repair. This image illustrates one of my favorite activities, pushing back on cars. Part 2 of this presentation will go into more detail about pushing back on cars. Removing the concrete does allow for some restoration of natural processes, certainly puts that space into more productive use, growing food. A single transformed suburban property is a great occasion, but the scale needs to increase a great deal. These images show a collaboration between myself and my next-door neighbor. We took out a laurel hedge that was right on our property line. We had to work together to remove the laurel hedge, and we both benefit with increased food production and satisfaction of a job well done. My place has become an educational resource for the neighborhood, the entire community, and actually it's a permaculture landmark in the Pacific Northwest. Literally, thousands of people have visited over the years to see what a suburban property can become. A very important part of the larger project of creating alternatives to capitalism and the consumer culture. Let's move along. This flowchart is essentially a moving table of contents. These are the topics we're going to take a look at in the rest of the presentation. And when you see the color, that indicates the topic that we're going to take a look at next. For the most part, capitalism is treated as a sacred cow. There is virtually no discussion about what are the options for taking care of our needs as individuals and a society. Perhaps one of capitalism's most remarkable products is the consumer culture. From this perspective, the consumer culture is one of history's greatest examples of mass social engineering. Perhaps the most primary ideal of capitalism is to create profits and economic growth, and in order to achieve that, supersizing almost everything is one of the primary characteristics of capitalism. For example, shelter supersized into suburbia, transportation supersized into cars, food supersized into meat and junk food. The consequences, of course, are severe damage to people and planet. This is a good point to do a pause. Have a closer look at this slide. What other examples of supersizing can you think of? Of course, economics goes way back. Just these images show a little bit of Neolithic economics, Middle Ages. The Phoenicians were all over the Mediterranean and beyond. There were businesses in ancient Rome that sold stock, and many credit Amsterdam with the world's first stock exchange in the early 1600s. Like almost any ideology, capitalism has its own set of mythology. It's time to poke the sacred cow. Let's take a look at some of the dishonesty and the mythologies of capitalism. External costs is a term used in economics, but it's usually ignored. Externalizing the cost means what we pay for a product or a service doesn't really cover the damage that product or service causes, whether to the environment or public health. Capitalism is fundamentally and hardwired to be dishonest because it doesn't tell an honest story about the products or services. Damage to people and planet is essentially an enormous subsidy to the economic system. An honest economic system would look very different from our sacred cow. Please pause, take a closer look. Climate change is an excellent example of an external cost. Efforts to put a price on carbon is a feeble attempt to address the issue of externalizing the cost. Economic efficiency is a primary boast of capitalism. Efficiency means producing the most benefit with the least amount of inputs. Air pollution, unneeded health expenses, suburbia, climate change, supersized urban areas, or military. These are all examples of extreme inefficiency. An honest economic system would avoid almost all of these costs. Spend some time contemplating this observation. Tens of millions of jobs in this country exist to repair the damage caused by the products and services created by tens of millions of other jobs. For example, the damage both to property and people from traffic accidents in a given year in the United States adds up to the better part of $1 trillion. Those are largely avoidable costs, and they employ a lot of people. Millions of jobs depend on extreme levels of inefficiency in this economic system. A good question to ask is, what would be an honest price for a very important commodity? One important commodity, of course, is gasoline. And I've seen a number of different speculations on what the true cost of a gallon of gasoline would be. That equation could include quite a few variables. Another well-rehearsed mythology is the magic hand of the marketplace. The images here, to many people, would not represent the best interests of society. Just about all of them completely avoidable. Capitalism concentrates economic power, and of course that leads to political power. Historically, statistics like what you see here lead to unstable social conditions. The profits from damaging products and practices are more important to the economic system than the well-being of people and planet. Another common product of capitalism and the consumer culture is the disempowerment of our citizenship. Imagine the benefits to any neighborhood, city, or town. A few tens of thousands of hours of community engagement. Let's zero in on one really important aspect of supersizing, that is, supersizing shelter in the form of suburbia. Transportation pretty much rules urban design. In the more recent century, transportation has been ruled by the automobile, and our urban design has benefited the businesses that sell cars, oil, tires, and infrastructure, but the results for the people who live in these places are not so good. Suburbia has benefited by historical conditions and the economic interests that made use of those historical conditions to sell its products. Economic interests strongly encourage the creation of the interstate highway system. At this point in history, an increasing number of observers is considering our dependency on automobiles to have been a very, very expensive bad choice. The car culture can definitely take credit for creating many, many jobs and a great deal of economic activity. On the other hand, a healthy, people and planet-friendly economic system could also create jobs and economic activity with only a fraction of the external cost. This striking graphic compares Atlanta, Georgia, and Barcelona, Spain, two cities with approximately the same population. The footprints are in scale. Atlanta's urban footprint is about 25 times the size of Barcelona. Interestingly, the two cities have approximately the same number of miles of light rail. Capitalism and the consumer culture has forced Atlanta into a marriage with the automobile that at this point would be almost impossible to pay for a divorce. Supersized consumption is the fuel of capitalism. Supersized consumption is the fuel of capitalism. How about reducing our ecological footprints? Let's give capitalism some positive credit. This economic system does provide many, many important healthy products and services, even if externalizing the cost makes them far cheaper than they should be. We still can't afford capitalism and the consumer culture. Given the trends, we should ask ourselves, does capitalism have to be a package deal? Imagine millions of people becoming far more mindful of what they buy and boycotting products and services of the economic system that don't fit a sustainable future. The sacred cow as a common denominator. When we consider our greatest challenges of this time in history, environmental damage, political and economic damage, public health damage, social damage, market capitalism and the consumer culture are the common denominator of all these problems. People in their own lives need to take responsibility too, but ultimately it is the profit-driven economic system that spends many, many, many billions of dollars persuading people to buy all the stuff that deserves our attention. Reducing our ecological footprints is a must as individuals and as a society. Basically, there are two scales to work with, at the individual scale at home and at the society scale with millions of people involved. I'd like to start with society at the larger scale, but the actions we need to take at larger scale are exactly the same actions we need to take as individuals. In the scenario I'm describing, thousands of community and progressive organizations and popular movements are essential participants to move this idea forward. Imagine if thousands of community and progressive organizations, along with less formalized social and political movements, recognized that reducing the power of the capitalist economy would mitigate many of the problems those organizations exist to deal with, and that reducing our ecological footprints to actually buy less stuff and move away from the consumer culture is a critical action for individuals and society to take to begin mitigating the many social, public health, economic, political, and environmental problems of our time. Next, imagine these activated organizations and social movements encouraging their members to downsize, to quit buying so much stuff, and these organizations and movements provided their members and supporters with how-to information that explained how to downsize and how downsizing helps mitigate the problems these organizations and movements are concerned with. And then these organizations coordinate with each other with outreach to the general public, civic leaders, business leaders, and elected representatives at all levels. I suggest pause here for a short time and just reflect on this idea. That's a lot to take in. Here are two slides that identify categories of activist organizations that could be receptive to this idea of advising their memberships to downsize. These organizations represent millions of people. A downsized capitalist economy and a downsized consumer culture would make the work of all of these organizations a lot easier. Downsizing lifestyles presents new opportunities to take progressive positive action on behalf of people and planet. Here are more categories of activist organizations, and note there are subcategories of activist organizations, and each of those subcategories would have lists of specific organizations, and each of those organizations would have memberships to reach out to. It's easy to speculate that there are tens of millions of people in the United States who support various progressive activist organizations. And if those organizations gave good reason for making some changes in lifestyle, lots of people would likely consider making those changes to downsize their lifestyles. These well-known movement organizations have millions of people who support them and agree with them, and would very likely take action to reduce their ecological footprint if they understood that would help the movement achieve its goals. We've been spending some time on downsized lifestyle. Let's be a little more specific. What might some of the changes be in a more ecologically responsible lifestyle, society, and economy? Speculating on what an ecologically responsible society might look like goes back generations, perhaps further back than the popular book Ecotopia. The Global Footprint Network asserts that for the entire world to live like the average American would require 5 planet Earths. That opinion would suggest that an acceptable, middle-of-the-road average lifestyle would consume 1/5 the amount of resources it does at this time. And affluent lifestyles, of course, would take a much bigger hit. A similar speculation suggests that an acceptable lifestyle would look something like the average lifestyle in Cuba at this point. Some might say our downsizing would require even more than that. Some might say we wouldn't have to downsize all that much. But for our growth requiring economy, any downsizing is completely unacceptable. The needs of capitalism are completely at odds with healthy people and a healthy planet. This slide is a little bit more specific information. Critical to assume that a sustainable future, everything will cost a lot more and people will not make nearly as much money. Our affluence, as we're used to at this time, is completely subsidized by overconsumption and damage to the natural world, and we just can't keep doing that. Internalizing the cost, honest prices, will come as a shock to just about everybody. This slide shows a comparison between the consumer culture and alternatives. This is a short essay. Please pause and read. Are humans ready for an enormous leap forward? Let's move on to system change. Okay, let's take a look at reducing ecological footprints. This content is useful both for individuals, and this would be the same kind of information organizations would send out to their membership. What you see here is certainly not complete, but it's a good start. Pause for a minute or so at this slide. Imagine if the wisdom of the world's great spiritual traditions were the guiding principles for our personal lifestyles, social systems, and our economy. Here are some goals of downsizing, and of course, downsizing ideals can be applied in many parts of our life, taking care of our needs. A sensible place to begin our downsizing adventure is to be more purposeful with what we do with our time and our money. This slide simply illustrates choices we have for what we do with our money and our time. The Global Footprint Network provides this map as a useful tool for comparing the size of ecological footprints all over the world. Is it the final word on this issue? I've traveled the world and I've been in every color on this map, and I think there's value to this map. The Global Footprint Network offers this free footprint calculator online. You can take this survey as you like. It's very educational. The calculator asks a variety of important questions about your lifestyle, such as your diet. The calculator asks questions about where you live, how do you live at home. Other questions are about travel, recreation, what you buy, mobility. At the end of the survey, the calculator will tell you how many planet Earths would be required for everybody in the world to live like you. For the average American, that number is 5 planet Earths, to provide all the resources and be able to clean up the mess that humans create. Recall the map we looked at earlier. These photos simply show some aspects of what a sustainable, one Earth, ecologically responsible lifestyle might look like. Again, this presentation is oriented towards the middle class and suburbia. But there are urban counterparts, there are lower income counterparts to all of these ideas and approaches. Let's take a quick look at some thoughtful examples of smart use of time and money. This is a tiny space a friend of mine put together using all recycled materials. It's completely charming and functional. Not to boast, but Hannah and Sandra attended an educational session I put on several years ago, and they put the ideas they learned to good use. Jessica and Matt in another neighborhood in Eugene have one of the most accomplished suburban transformation projects I know of anywhere. They produce a lot of basic needs on site, and it's an outstanding educational resource for the community. Their place is an exceptional example of what smart use of time and money can produce. A church in my neighborhood, just a few blocks away, made this space available on their property to start a community garden. Many civic organizations have all kinds of assets that could be put to good use for the well-being of people and planet. MySpace, again, the product of a well-defined set of priorities, ideals, and values, time and money. Duma is a great example of reducing ecological footprints and making great use of available assets, in particular this 10-bedroom house, which is now a housing co-op, an inspiring place to visit, with many, many benefits for the people who live there. This is East Blair Housing Co-op, also in Eugene, one of my absolutely favorite places. All kinds of examples of making good use of on-site assets, of putting time and money to good use for multiple benefits. In part 2 of this presentation, we'll go into more detail on a number of eco-villages in Eugene, Portland, Cincinnati, Ohio, and Los Angeles. On a larger scale, imagine what could be done in a neighborhood for people to synchronize, to coordinate, to work together for reducing their eco-footprints, taking care of more needs closer to home, and creating alternatives to capitalism and the consumer culture. Allies, assets, and actions. This will be the final topic for Part 1, creating alternatives to capitalism and the consumer culture. Part 2 of this presentation is essentially all about allies, assets, and actions. I love these stories. Essentially a preview of a preferred future. Allies and assets come in all kinds of shapes and sizes and conditions. And one of the core ideals of creating alternatives to capitalism and the consumer culture are the actions to repurpose these assets and building community with the allies we work with. Virtually every city, town, neighborhood, even suburban property have surprising allies and assets, including our own selves, our time, and our money. This graphic illustrates the dynamics of the virtuous triangle. Assets, allies, and actions all support and elevate each other. Permaculture is an enormously useful set of design principles. You can find out more about permaculture by going online. Search permaculture. Also on YouTube, there's tons of information about permaculture in action. Again, the act of defining our priorities with time and money is time well spent. Again, the footprint calculator. This is a powerful tool for the point of departure for people to begin thinking about the issue of their eco-footprint and how they can make that footprint smaller. Consider this slide to be a preview of Part 2, creating alternatives to capitalism and the consumer culture. We'll take a closer look at all of these images, all of these stories, and more in Part 2. Very briefly, what you see here is my neighborhood recreation center, a permaculture site tour, a front yard garden in Brooklyn, New York, intersection repair in Portland, a community event to help design the future of a neighborhood, A run-down apartment complex turned into an eco-village. Interactions with the city. What could a street look like in Paris, France, with a car-free retrofit? Onondaga Earth Core in Syracuse, New York, turning a neighborhood problem into a neighborhood asset in Olympia, Washington. Eco-minded and neighborhood-minded community redevelopment in Portland. Superblocks in Barcelona, Spain, may be my favorite example of pushing back on cars. We'll take a closer look at all these stories and more in Part 2. We are at the midpoint of creating alternatives to capitalism and the consumer culture. Here's a short look at Part 1 of our presentation. We recall a critique of capitalism and the consumer culture, history of suburbia, progressive organizations and movements for the boycott, reducing eco-footprints, allies' assets and actions, prioritizing time and money and calculating an eco-footprint, capitalism as a common denominator to motivate and synchronize with other organizations in common cause. Take a few moments for your own review. A lot of great information here. Part 2 will focus on allies, assets, and actions to create alternatives to capitalism and the consumer culture. Please join us for Part 2, and also please share this presentation with your friends. These are related presentations and conversations on YouTube. Much of what you've seen in Part 1 of this presentation was lifted from the presentations you see on the left. And the conversations on the right are with pioneers of a preferred future. All of them with inspiring projects. They show and tell these projects in these conversations. Finally, I hope you've enjoyed the presentation. Even more so, I hope the content from this presentation helps you become a more effective advocate for alternatives to capitalism and the consumer culture. Be strong, be well, but don't be shy.